You know what's wild? For nearly 2,000 years, we thought we had Pompeii figured out. Ancient city, tragic ending, bodies frozen in time by volcanic fury. But here's the thing. Scientists just analyzed DNA from those iconic ash-covered bodies, and what they found is completely flipping our understanding of Roman society upside down. We're talking about families that weren't actually families, identities that were completely wrong, and social structures that challenge everything we learned in history class. If you're into mind-blowing historical discoveries that make you question everything, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is about to take you on a ride through time that ends with some seriously shocking revelations. Let's set the stage. August 24th, 79 AD, and Mount Vesuvius erupts with a force so catastrophic that it buries the entire city of Pompeii under tons of volcanic ash and pumice. The eruption happens so fast that people are literally frozen mid-action. Some are running, some are huddled together, some are clutching valuables or each other. When archaeologists started excavating Pompeii in the 1700s, they discovered these haunting voids in the hardened ash, perfect molds where bodies had decomposed over centuries. Using plaster casting techniques, they filled these voids and created the famous figures we see in museums today. Tragic, beautiful, and utterly heartbreaking. For generations, researchers looked at these figures and constructed narratives. They saw what they thought were mothers protecting children, fathers shielding families, and lovers embracing in their final moments. These stories became part of Pompeii's legend. School textbooks featured them, documentaries dramatized them, museums displayed them with plaques describing the presumed relationships. But here's what nobody could do until very recently: actually check if those stories were true. Enter modern genetic science. A team of researchers led by scientists from Harvard University and the University of Florence decided to do something that would have seemed like science fiction just a few decades ago. They extracted DNA from the skeletal remains inside those plaster casts. We're not talking about easy, pristine samples either. This is ancient DNA that's been sitting in volcanic debris for 2 millennia, exposed to heat, moisture, and chemical reactions that typically destroy genetic material. The odds were stacked against them. Ancient DNA is notoriously difficult to work with because it degrades over time, breaks into tiny fragments, and gets contaminated by bacteria and environmental DNA. But the same ash that killed these people also preserved them in ways we're only beginning to understand. The rapid burial created an oxygen-free environment that slowed decomposition. The minerals in the ash actually helped stabilize some of the biomolecules. Using cutting-edge extraction techniques and next-generation sequencing technology, the team managed to pull viable genetic material from bone samples. They focused on 14 individuals from several well-known castes, the ones that had been interpreted as family groups or couples based on their positions and proximity to each other. What they discovered when they analyzed this DNA, it contradicted almost every assumption we'd made. Let's talk about the most famous example, the one that's really shaking up the archaeological community. There's this iconic cast that everyone calls the Two Maidens. It shows two figures embracing, and for over a century, it was assumed to be a mother and daughter, or possibly two sisters, clinging to each other in terror as death approached. It's been featured in countless books and documentaries as a symbol of familial love in the face of catastrophe. Museums described it as one of the most emotionally powerful artifacts from Pompeii. Except here's the problem. The DNA analysis revealed that at least one of these individuals was male. Not only that, but they weren't related to each other at all. Zero genetic connection. These weren't family members sharing a final embrace. And so who were they? That's where it gets really interesting and complicated. They could have been friends, master and slave, business partners, or complete strangers who happened to die near each other. The positions we see in the casts don't necessarily reflect their actual positions at death. Remember, these are reconstructions made by pouring plaster into voids. The bodies had decomposed and shifted over centuries. The archaeologists who made these casts in the 18 and 1900s positioned them based on their own cultural assumptions about how people would behave in a crisis. They saw what they expected to see and filled in the gaps with Victorian-era family values. But the revelations don't stop there. Another case that's completely overturning our assumptions involves what was interpreted as a nuclear family. So 4 individuals found in a house, positioned in a way that suggested parents protecting children. The narrative was compelling. Here was a wealthy family trapped in their home, the adults trying desperately to shield their offspring from the pyroclastic surge. It fit perfectly with our notions of parental instinct and family bonds. DNA analysis told a different story entirely. The individuals showed no genetic relationship to one another. None. Not parent-child, not siblings, nothing. Even more surprising, the analysis revealed diverse geographic origins based on their genetic markers. These people didn't even come from the same ancestral populations. So what were they doing in that house together? This is where we have to completely reimagine Roman household structure. See, we often project our modern concept of the nuclear family onto ancient cultures, but Roman households were way more complex. A wealthy Roman home might include not just blood relatives, but slaves, freedmen, clients, business associates, and visitors, all living under one roof. The person who owned the house might have been away when the eruption happened. The people who died there might have been servants, or they might have run inside seeking shelter when the ash started falling. We don't know, and that's the point. We've been confidently telling their stories for centuries without actually knowing anything about them. The genetic analysis also revealed something fascinating about the diversity of Pompeii itself. For a long time, there was this assumption that Roman cities were relatively homogeneous and populated mainly by people from the Italian peninsula. Sure, the empire was vast and cosmopolitan at the top levels in Rome itself, but provincial cities like Pompeii, the thinking went that they were more insular. The DNA evidence is smashing that assumption to pieces. The genetic markers from these Pompeii victims show ancestry from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Some individuals had genetic signatures indicating Eastern Mediterranean origins. Others showed North African ancestry. One person had genetic markers suggesting origins from the steppes of Central Asia. This wasn't just a couple of foreign merchants passing through. This was a genuinely multicultural city with permanent residents from all over the known world. It makes sense when you think about it. Pompeii was a major commercial hub, a port city with connections throughout the Mediterranean. It was part of an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from North Africa to the Rhine. People moved around, whether as soldiers, slaves, merchants, or migrants seeking opportunity. The genetic diversity we're seeing in Pompeii is probably representative of many Roman cities. This has huge implications for how we understand Roman identity. Was being Roman about ethnicity or citizenship and culture? The DNA evidence strongly suggests the latter. Let's dig into another shocking finding about one specific individual that really highlights how wrong we can be. There was a figure found wearing a golden bracelet, positioned with jewelry and luxury items nearby. Based on these material cues and the perceived physical characteristics from the cast, an archaeologists identified this person as an adult woman, probably wealthy, maybe the matriarch of the household. Entire scholarly papers were written analyzing the jewelry, discussing women's fashion in Pompeii, using this figure as evidence for various theories about Roman women's status. The DNA, male, genetically unambiguously male. Now, this doesn't mean ancient Romans made a mistake. They knew who this person was, but it means we've been wrong for over 100 years. So why was a man wearing what was interpreted as women's jewelry? Well, maybe our assumptions about gendered fashion are too rigid. Maybe the bracelet wasn't gendered the way we think. Maybe he was holding it for someone else. Maybe fashion and gender expression in ancient Rome were more fluid than we've acknowledged. Or maybe, and this is important, that the jewelry was displaced by the volcanic forces or during the archaeological process, and it wasn't actually on him at all. We've been constructing elaborate theories on potentially faulty foundations. The technical challenges of getting this DNA evidence deserve some attention because it's honestly incredible this worked at all. Ancient DNA, especially from environments like volcanic burial, is incredibly degraded. We're talking about fragments that are maybe 50 to 100 base pairs long, compared to intact DNA sequences that are millions of base pairs. These fragments are also heavily modified by chemical processes over time. You get crosslinks, breaks, and damage that makes sequencing really difficult. Then there's contamination. Every archaeologist who touched these remains, every conservator, and every tourist who breathed near them potentially left modern DNA that can swamp the ancient signal. The researchers had to use incredibly stringent protocols. They worked in clean rooms designed for ancient DNA work. They took multiple samples and verified results across different bone elements. They used bioinformatics to identify and filter out contamination. They looked for specific damage patterns that are characteristic of ancient DNA to verify authenticity. They also had to extract DNA from deep inside bones, like the petrous part of the temporal bone or the inner tooth pulp, because that's where ancient DNA is best preserved. Even then, they could only successfully extract and sequence DNA from about half the individuals they sampled. The ones that worked gave us these shocking insights. But there are still many Pompeii victims whose genetic secrets remain locked away, perhaps forever. What does all this mean for how we study ancient history going forward? First, it's a massive wake-up call about the dangers of assumption. For generations, scholars constructed narratives based on physical positioning, artifacts, and cultural expectations from their own time period. They were projecting Victorian family values onto Romans, assuming nuclear family structures, and making determinations about sex and relationships without hard evidence. These weren't bad historians. They were working with the tools and frameworks they had, but we need to be honest that many of our confident historical narratives are actually educated guesses at best. Second, it demonstrates the incredible power of integrating hard science with traditional archaeology. For centuries, archaeology was about careful excavation, cataloging artifacts, and interpreting context. Now we can add genetics, isotope analysis, proteomics, and other techniques that extract biological information from remains. We can tell where people grew up based on isotopes in their teeth. We can identify diseases from ancient pathogens. We can trace population movements and intermixing. We can determine actual biological relationships instead of guessing. This doesn't replace traditional archaeology, but it supercharges it. The combination of methods gives us a much richer, more accurate picture of the past. There's also something profound here about identity and how we construct it. The people of Pompeii didn't have DNA tests. They didn't define family the way we do. A Roman familia included everyone under the household's authority, slaves and all, not just blood relatives. Adoption was common and carried full legal weight. Freedmen often maintained close relationships with former masters. Patron-client relationships created bonds that could be as strong as family. When we look at people positioned together in death and assume they're biologically related, we're missing the complexity of Roman social bonds. The DNA is teaching us that proximity doesn't mean kinship, at least not genetic kinship. But here's the thing, the social kinship was real to them, and maybe that's what matters. If a slave considered their master's household their family, if freedmen maintained lifelong bonds with patrons, if unrelated people created chosen families. And then the stories we told weren't entirely wrong. They just weren't about genetics. The challenge is separating our modern obsession with biological relationship from the more fluid social realities of the Roman world. Let's think about the ethical dimensions of this research too. Is it right to extract DNA from these ancient victims? They obviously couldn't consent. Some cultures and communities have strong feelings about disturbing the dead or using human remains for research. There's an ongoing debate in archaeology about who has the right to study ancient people and what limits should exist. In this case, researchers argue that the scientific value justifies the minimal damage to the remains. They took small samples from areas that wouldn't affect the integrity of the casts or the skeletons. The knowledge gained helps us understand these people as they actually were, not as Victorian archaeologists imagined them. It corrects misinformation and gives us a more accurate picture of Roman diversity and society. But others might argue that these people suffered a traumatic death and have been on display for centuries, and maybe we should let them rest rather than continuously extracting information from their bodies. There's no easy answer. What's clear is that as technology advances, we need ongoing conversations about the ethics of studying ancient remains, who gets to make decisions about them, and how we balance scientific inquiry with respect for the dead. So what's next for Pompeii research? This DNA study looked at 14 individuals. There are over 1,000 sets of remains from Pompeii, and that's just what's been excavated. Large portions of the city remain buried. As extraction and sequencing techniques improve, we'll hopefully get genetic data from many more individuals, building a comprehensive genetic portrait of the population. Researchers also want to sequence ancient pathogens. Pompeii victims might carry bacterial or viral DNA that tells us about disease in the Roman world. They want to look at dietary markers, stress indicators in bones, and chemical signatures that reveal what life was like before that catastrophic day. There are also plans to combine genetic data with isotope analysis of teeth and bones. Isotopes can tell us where someone grew up, how their diet changed over their lifetime, and when they moved to Pompeii if they weren't local. Match that with genetic ancestry, and you get incredibly detailed migration stories. Imagine being able to say that a specific individual was born in Egypt, moved to Pompeii in their 20s based on isotope shifts, had Eastern Mediterranean ancestry, and lived in a particular house with unrelated individuals. That level of biographical detail from 2,000 years ago seemed impossible just a decade ago. This research is also part of a broader revolution in how we understand the Roman Empire. For a long time, especially in earlier scholarship, there was a tendency to emphasize Rome's European identity, to downplay the diversity and focus on the Greco-Roman cultural core. This was partly innocent scholarly focus, and partly, let's be honest, influenced by nationalistic and racial ideologies, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But modern archaeology and genetics are painting a very different picture. The Roman Empire was astonishingly diverse. Genetic studies of other Roman sites across Europe show similar patterns. Populations with ancestry from across the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Near East. There were African Roman emperors, Syrian and Spanish emperors. The Roman army recruited from everywhere and moved soldiers thousands of miles from home. Merchants, slaves, diplomats, and refugees created a cosmopolitan mix that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. Pompeii isn't an exception. It's the rule. This matters because it challenges modern nationalist narratives that try to claim exclusive cultural descent from Rome. The Roman world was everyone's heritage, a multinational, multi-ethnic empire united by law, language, and culture, not ethnicity. Before we wrap up, let's talk about what this means for those iconic images we've all seen. The plaster casts of Pompeii are some of the most powerful historical artifacts in existence. They put human faces on ancient tragedy. They let us connect emotionally across 2 millennia. But now we know that many of the stories attached to them are wrong. Does that make them less powerful? I don't think so. If anything, it makes them more interesting. These weren't just generic ancient Romans. They were real individuals with complex lives, diverse origins, and relationships we're only beginning to understand. The man with the bracelet wasn't just a wealthy woman. He was a person whose actual story we've lost, whose identity is now a mystery that invites investigation rather than assumption. The 2 maidens aren't a simple story of maternal love. They're a puzzle about who these people were to each other, what brought them to that moment, and why they died together. The so-called family that wasn't related reminds us that family is as much about who you live with and care for as about genetics. In a way, stripping away the false narratives makes space for the truth to be more complex and more human. This discovery about Pompeii's DNA evidence is a perfect example of why we should never assume history is settled. Every generation looks at the past through its own lens, with its own biases and limitations. New technology, new perspectives, and new questions constantly reveal how much we don't know. The confident narratives in textbooks and museums are always provisional, always subject to revision when new evidence emerges. That's not a weakness of historical study. It's a strength. It means we're always getting closer to truth, always refining our understanding. The people of Pompeii deserve to be understood as they actually were, not as we imagine them to be. Thanks to DNA analysis, we're finally starting to see them clearly. A diverse, cosmopolitan community of people from across the ancient world, living complex lives in relationships that defied simple categorization, all caught in a moment of terrible tragedy that somehow, 2,000 years later, is teaching us to question everything we thought we knew. If this story blew your mind even half as much as it blew mine, make sure you're subscribed, because history is full of these reality-shattering discoveries, and we're just getting started. And here's what really gets me thinking about all of this. We're living in a moment where technology is fundamentally changing how we access the past. Just 50 years ago, the idea of extracting DNA from 2,000-year-old volcanic ash would have seemed like pure science fiction. Today, it's routine, or becoming routine anyway. In another 50 years, imagine what we'll be able to do. We might be able to reconstruct faces from ancient DNA with photographic accuracy. We might be able to map out entire family trees going back centuries, showing how populations mixed and moved. We might even be able to understand personalities, predispositions, and health conditions from genetic markers. These aren't just cool technical achievements. They fundamentally change how we relate to ancient people. They make them real in ways that traditional archaeology, as powerful as it is, and sometimes can't quite achieve. When you read that someone had Levantine ancestry and lived in a Roman city, it's interesting. When you can build out their likely appearance, their genetic connections to other populations, maybe even predict their eye color or disease susceptibilities, suddenly they're a person you can almost imagine meeting. But this also raises uncomfortable questions. How do we avoid repeating the mistakes of earlier generations? We've established that 19th century archaeologists projected their own cultural values onto Roman remains. We've shown how assumptions about gender, family, and ethnicity colored their interpretations. What biases are we projecting right now that future scientists will laugh at or cringe over? We probably don't even know. That's the nature of bias. It's invisible from inside it. Maybe we're making wrong assumptions about what genetic ancestry actually means about identity. Maybe we're overinterpreting isotope signatures. Maybe we're missing crucial cultural context that would completely change how we understand these DNA results. The honest answer is that we should be humble about our conclusions while still being excited about the evidence. We should hold our current understanding lightly, knowing that new discoveries will challenge it. There's also something worth considering about how we choose which ancient people to study. The Pompeii victims have received this incredible attention partly because they're already famous, partly because the conditions preserve them so well, and partly because they're accessible to European and American researchers. But what about the millions of other ancient people whose remains we'll never sequence? What about populations that don't get excavated, or whose remains were destroyed, or whose archaeological sites never got proper scientific attention? There's an inherent bias in which histories get told, which ancient people get studied in depth, and which ones remain anonymous. The Pompeii research is wonderful, but we should also be thinking about expanding genetic studies to lesser-known sites, to underrepresented populations, to the people and places that don't naturally attract headlines. That's harder work. It doesn't have the drama of overturning famous interpretations, but it's crucial for building a truly comprehensive picture of the ancient world, rather than just focusing on the sites and stories that already have our attention. Let's also think about what this means for how we present history to the public. Museums are grappling with this right now. Do you keep the old plaques that describe the two maidens as a mother and daughter, understanding that they're inaccurate, but that they have emotional power? Do you remove them and replace them with more cautious language about what we actually know? Do you tell visitors that we got it wrong for a century? Different museums are handling this differently. Some have updated their exhibits to include information about the DNA findings. Others have kept traditional interpretations while acknowledging scientific limitations. What's interesting is that many visitors prefer the updated, more honest approach, even if it's less emotionally satisfying. To be told we don't know the relationships between the two maidens, it feels more respectful to the actual people involved. We're not inventing stories about them. We're acknowledging the mystery and inviting visitors into the real work of trying to understand the past. The Pompeii discovery also has implications beyond archaeology and into how we think about family and kinship more broadly. Western culture has become increasingly focused on genetic relationships. We've invented genealogy as both a hobby and an obsession. We do DNA tests to find distant cousins. We use genetic information to understand our heritage. There's something very 21st century about this emphasis on genetics as the ultimate truth of relationship. But the Romans and many other historical cultures had a much more expansive and flexible notion of family. Your family was who you lived with, who you were bound to by law or custom, who you depended on and who depended on you. The people in that house in Pompeii, even if they shared no DNA, might have been family in every way that mattered to them. That's worth remembering as we increasingly let genetics define our understanding of relationship. Family is ultimately a social and emotional reality, not just a biological one. There's also a lovely irony here about how science works. We developed increasingly sophisticated tools to understand the past. We built better methods for extracting and analyzing ancient DNA. We created algorithms to detect contamination and verify results. We pushed the absolute boundaries of what's possible with 2,000-year-old remains. And what did all that technology reveal? Not definitive answers, but complexity and nuance and mystery. Oh, we solved the technical problem of getting DNA from Pompeii remains, only to discover that the remains themselves raise more questions than they answer. Who were these people really? How did they relate to each other? What was their social world actually like? The DNA tells us they weren't who we thought, but it doesn't tell us who they were. That's actually profound in a way. It reminds us that no amount of data completely captures the reality of a human life. There's always mystery. There's always something beyond what science can measure. So as we wrap this up and think about what all of this means, I keep coming back to this idea of intellectual humility. The Pompeii DNA research is this beautiful demonstration of how wrong confident certainty can be. These interpretations stood for over a century. They were repeated in textbooks. They were displayed in museums. They were taught to generations of students as established fact, and they were wrong. That doesn't mean the archaeologists were bad at their jobs. They were working with the information available to them, using the interpretive frameworks of their time. But it does mean that we should be cautious about our own certainties. The things we're confident about today might seem laughably wrong to future generations. That's not a reason to give up on trying to understand history. It's a reason to pursue understanding while remaining open to being proved wrong. It's a reason to value new evidence and new methods. It's a reason to keep asking questions and investigating. Looking at this from yet another angle, there's something really important about how this research democratizes access to the past. And for a long time, what we knew about ancient Rome came primarily from written sources, from the perspectives of educated elites who could write. The poor, the enslaved, the marginalized, the voiceless of the ancient world left few written records. We had to infer their existence from archaeological artifacts and mentions in elite texts. But DNA doesn't care about social status. It tells us about the genetic ancestry and characteristics of slaves just as clearly as it tells us about emperors. Isotope analysis of a slave's teeth is just as revealing as that of a wealthy landowner. In a way, modern science is giving voice to people history largely forgot. We're learning about the diversity and complexity of ordinary ancient lives in ways that written history simply couldn't reveal. And that's genuinely transformative for how we understand the ancient world. If you've made it this far, and you're still thinking about the two maidens, still wondering about that man with the bracelet, still trying to picture what that house in Pompeii really looked like when real people were living in it before the volcano erupted, then you've caught what makes history so compelling. It's not just about memorizing dates and names, it's about encountering real people across time and trying to understand their lives, their choices, their relationships, their deaths. The Pompeii DNA research takes that basic human impulse and amplifies it by forcing us to really confront our own assumptions and biases. We thought we knew these stories. We were wrong. And that wrongness, that fundamental overturning of our certainty, is where real learning happens. So thank you for going on this journey through volcanic ash and genetic sequencing and the complicated realities of Roman households. If you found this as fascinating as I did, please hit that subscribe button because there are so many more stories like this out there. Stories about how new discoveries are constantly reshaping everything we thought we knew. History isn't something that happened and then got figured out. It's a living, evolving conversation between the present and the past, and we're all part of that conversation. Welcome to the community, and we'll see you in the next video.